Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibis, happy Monday. Hope you've had a great day. Real quick, want to give a big thank you to Patricia for the very generous PayPal donation. I really do appreciate that. Also, music fact of the day, the song Take Me Home by Phil Collins is actually about somebody who was in a mental institution. And the lyrics were heavily inspired by the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I thought it was a love song. I was way off, y'all. All right. So, Wagner case. We got to discuss a few things. Number one, as we know, people can opt out of being audio recorded, one or the other. Some people have had just audio, which is helpful, but when nobody allows themselves to be recorded, it's hard. So what I have found is this: it may be on the days where we have people who opt out and you kind of have to go searching for information. We may end up and do an episode on this trial about every other day. And sometimes there's just, without having screenshots to kind of make it easy to follow along with, there are times I don't know exactly what they're talking about. It's made it very difficult. I've never seen a case where the judge doesn't allow a drop of blood to be shown on screen. This is the first time in probably 10 years I've done this. So anything as far as inside the homes, we can't see. So it limits really a lot of things. I don't care to see bodies at all. Crime scene photos do show the brutality of the event and gives context. So we're going to do Friday and today's testimony. And it was pretty much this dude all day Friday, half the day today. And his name is Shane Hanshaw. He's with Ohio's Bureau of Criminal Investigations, Special Investigations Unit. He did opt into being recorded. Thank you, sir. And he was called in to help with the investigation. He knew there were multiple death scenes. He just didn't know how many. He didn't have specifics. But once he got there, they knew of at least the 3. We know that Kenneth was found later in the day. So he was assigned to scene 1, which was Chris Sr.'s house and Gary. So he arrived on scene around 12:20 p.m., and he was the primary agent for the scene. So when he got there, just basic stuff, who's been inside. We know Deputy Ball, Officer Music, who testified last week, and they opted out of being recorded, were in there. So he asked everybody for fingerprints for elimination purposes to make sure that they're not, going to have this unknown set of prints and it be an officer who was in the house. So he walked inside the trailer to get an idea of what was going on. And as soon as he walked in and saw everything, he knew it was a really complex crime scene. So he backed out. And he saw multiple bullet holes near the door and through the screen door frame. So he took some blind swabs, hopefully to get some unseen DNA on the exterior of the outside door. And I really think the Wagners obviously wore gloves because there was no DNA. And speaking of DNA, just to get this out of the way, both sides stipulate that at Chris Sr.'s place where he and Gary were murdered, there was absolutely no DNA from the Wagners, any of the Wagners found at that scene, and all the DNA found were from Chris and Gary. So that was one thing too. Just otherwise we can go through, they took this swab, they took that swab, and it would take a lot of time and it gets a little monotonous. So they had 3D scanners to use, and we'll have later on the guy who actually did that testified. But it's a documentation tool and it gives you measurements. You can tell the distance between points, and it gives you just a really nice mock-up of the crime scene that you can bring into the courtroom so the jurors can actually look and see kind of a view of the entire house. There was a delay in getting that scanner. So they had got the search warrant while they were waiting on that scanner to arrive. And so they started doing a walkthrough, which is a search, but not a primary evidence search. But we're going to start with outside the house. So outside, they found where the external video camera was mounted on one of the grow houses, and it was pointing towards Chris's residence, which they thought would be great because it may have caught something that happened that night. But the Wagners knew exactly where the camera was and where the DVR was. So, excuse me, they go upstairs and find a gray colored door handle. I'm going to pull that up, laying on the ground. I've got a little arrow because this is hard to see, but there was signs of forced entry up inside this grow house upstairs. So they were actually going up there to find that DVR, thinking it might show the perpetrators, the murderers. And they swabbed there was some transfer blood on that door. I've got red arrows pointing. It's really small. It ended up being Gary Roden's DNA. So, and then once they get inside, they realize that the DVR has been taken. They find all the wires, but no DVR. So that was out. There was insufficient DNA on those cords. Outside, they saw evidence of grow operations where they utilized fans and air conditioned units. And it seemed to be a pretty, well oiled grow operation, I guess you could say. But it didn't really look like a lot because these are a couple of the same pictures. But if you look on the top left here, I mean, that's a really small amount of marijuana being grown. Now, we haven't heard about fields and acres of this stuff being grown. I don't know how much he was growing. I don't, is it enough to just give you some extra jingle in your pocket or whatever? But they did find a lot of money, and we'll talk about that later. But projectiles, there's a lot of them, and I'm not going to get into a ton of this stuff. What is interesting is once they got the 3D scanner, I'm going to put all these pictures on the drive. You can look at them. I'll put the link in the description. If you're on YouTube, you're seeing them. So they were able to, with the 3D scanner, to do a trajectory of where these shots came from. And obviously, you can see it's from the ground pointing up. Remember, we heard the boys were underneath the trucks waiting on them to walk in front of the trailer. And then George was supposed to take that shot at Chris Sr. He chickened out. So Jake starts clearly, shooting up the front of the house. Now, we know that Chris's arm was broken by the rifle. I think maybe that is the one shot that Jake actually got on him. And here's the thing. Remember, Billy, the dad, was inside the house when Chris Sr. was being shot at. And so I was thinking, you know how they said that he came out, he was freaking out saying, I just shot my best friend. I really think once Jake opened fire with all these bullets, that Billy got freaked out that he was about to get hit. I don't think he cared about Chris Sr. He overkilled him. He shot him so many times. And we know that because of the type of gun that was used. It was a handgun. So they just found bullets kind of all over the place around the recliner. And I'm going to put this other graphic up. You can see it really looks like Chris Sr. was hit a couple of times on the front porch. There's some blood there. You can see it looks to me like maybe he was running around this chair to get away from Billy. And then you see those red drag marks. This was introduced on Friday. So you can see kind of how this played out. Then you have that one in the bedroom. I think that maybe is where, like the transfer, like a continuation is what they call it. And I believe Gary was shot in the kitchen. So the investigator said he didn't see any signs of struggle in that house. So what they call these piles of blood is you can tell where the bloodletting event occurred, which essentially is where they fell. And so we talked about the stipulation that there was no Wagner DNA found, but DNA in the living room came from Chris Sr. There was blood spatter on the wall, and the bodies were dragged from the living room through the kitchen. And footwear impressions found in the kitchen was actually the very last bit of evidence that they collected. You can see that in this middle picture here because it's a very tedious process and it's very precise. And you don't have a lot of do-overs when you're getting these shoe print impressions. It's got to be done right. So physical evidence, they found a notebook in the kitchen with some names in it, and it said Billy straight down the line. But what we learned is this is the kind of login sheet that Bobby Joe Manley used when she would come do work at Chris Sr.'s house. And the Billy that she was listing was the Billy that was with her the day the bodies were found. And also, Billy testified right after Bobby Joe that first day of testimony. So they found a broken pair of glasses with the lens out in the living room and at the entrance of the kitchen area. There's a drag mark and a lot of blood in that area, and they believe that's from Gary. If you look to the far right on this graphic, there's a New York Jets ball cap that belonged to Gary, and it had a defect in the back of the hat. Part of the bullet actually fell out when they lifted it up, and there was part of a bullet lodged in the bill of the hat. They found 4 cell phones in the house. That's on the far left. And then there was a flashlight by the bodies. It was tested for blood or DNA, and Gary was the contributor on the flashlight itself as well as the batteries. So as far as the bodies go, they documented the hand position and the clothing position. And we know they had a blanket over them when they were found. They took really close up photos of their hands to look for any signs of a struggle. And Gary's head was laying next to Chris's lower leg. So if you could imagine, they're laying opposite. So Gary's feet would be at Chris's head and then vice versa. So the bodies were found with their arms above their heads and their shirts were rolled up. Excuse me. And their jeans were bunched up, which told investigators that they were dragged by their feet from the living room into the bedroom. On Chris's upper torso, he had an accumulation of blood. His wallet was found between his legs in an open position, and both shoes were on. They had moved eventually Gary's body to better document his injuries. He had a lot of blood around the mouth, some discoloration around the eyes, and a bullet hole near the ear. They took vacuuming samples from the victim's clothing, and I heard him say from the skin that was exposed. The bodies weren't moved until the coroner, until after 3 a.m. And the reason for that, he said there was no disrespect intended, but the amount of evidence throughout that whole house, it would have been a huge risk to potentially disturb that evidence. So once they had everything they needed, then they removed the bodies, which was more than 24 hours after the murders. So on cross exam, there's a couple of things that they're referring to that they do not elaborate on. One is this 4th of July fireworks thing that Chris Sr. had. And now it's a Ford F-150, a silver Ford F-150 that was in Chris's driveway. He's asked both witnesses today about this truck. They don't know who it belongs to. So the defense shows a photo of a grow room, and they also point out a door frame. And he makes a comment about the hinges, saying it would lock on the right side of the door frame. And then he asked about the blood stains that he identified. So the defense says, when you were inside the grow room, was that all that was in the building? And he's referring to the picture we just shown. Put it back up there. And he says, I believe there were other plants, but not in this photograph. So then the defense asked, do you have a number of plants? And he said, no. And the defense asked, was it your job to document how many marijuana plants were in there? And he said, not at that time. So the defense says, well, was it at any point? And he said, no. So he says, you arrived after noon, a few hours after the bodies are found. Do you know how many people entered that trailer before you? And the agent said the 2 officers and Bobby Joe, who entered the house and found the victims as far as he knew, were the only ones who did. He was asked, when you arrived, did you do the exterior photos before you looked inside? And he said, I believe I did. Then he was asked about the Tyvek suits, kind of just the white suits that they put on to protect themselves from biological evidence as well as the crime scene. And he asked when he put it on, and he said it was before he went in the house. Then the defense attorney verified the other agent had the Tyvek suit on as well. And he was asked, was the other agent inside when you were at all times? And he said, not always. So the defense wanted to know if the other agent took photos as well. And he said, it's possible. And then he says, did you move carefully when you were in the house? Well, yeah. So when you arrived, were there any interior lights on? And he says he doesn't recall. So then he mentions the lighting conditions inside the trailer at the time of the murders. And the agent doesn't know. He said it seems like they weren't on, but he doesn't know. So they talk about the 3 a.m. removal of the bodies. Did you ever return to the trailer? And he says, no. I discussed with my supervisor that someone needed to return. And if you recall, we had not gotten underneath that residence yet. They knew there might be a bullet underneath the flooring. There were many things that needed to be done. However, we did not get the evidence. I'm sorry. They needed to get the evidence they had collected to a facility to get the processing started. And he said it was his understanding that someone would come back, but it wasn't him. He had other case obligations. So then he was asked about the lens being out of the eyeglasses, and he asked the agent if he thought that was an indication of a struggle. And he said, I didn't think so. I mean, you have to look, Gary was shot in the head with a gun. And so it's not out of the realm of possibility that the force of that knocked the lens out of the frame and messed the glasses up. So then he gets into this whole thing about gloves. What kind of gloves were you using? He says latex. Why did you choose those? Well, they were double thick, less of a possibility to transfer. And the defense says if I were wearing a cloth glove, like a jersey glove, which are work gloves, and I dipped my hand into water and touched a doorknob, what would you expect to find? And the agent's like, I don't know. And the defense says water. And the agent says, I guess. So the defense says it's the same with blood. If I dip my hands in blood and touch the doorknob, it could transfer, right? And the agent says, yes. Then he says, if I put a jersey glove on and then another, there could be DNA on the exterior of the glove for me touching it, and that could be transferred. And he says, yes. So imagine you got one glove on, you're pulling the other one on, and you've held it with your hand. I don't know where he's going with some of this stuff. So they show a diagram of biological evidence, and he said this was prepared but not to scale. And he asked, what does that mean? And he said, if a grid were laid out on paper and a measurement taken of a building, if it's not to scale on that grid, it would not give exterior dimensions or wall dimensions, but it would give a rough example of what you're documenting, but not to scale. It's not exact measurements. So the defense asked, were there exact measurements made inside? And the agent said, it depends on the 3D scanner, and I didn't do that. So then he asked, were there other measurements taken inside or outside? And the agent says, no. The defense says, you testified about the cords in the grow house. Did you find any evidence of blood on the cords? And he said, no. Did you collect the cameras you saw outside? And he said, no. The defense says there's a large safe in Chris's room. Was it open or closed? And the agent said, I believe it was closed. Then he was asked, did you ever open it? The agent says no. So the defense asked, as you stood at the doorway into the bedroom looking at the bodies, was Gary's body farthest away from the door and Chris was closest? And the agent said, yeah, it appears that Gary was dragged in first and then Chris Sr. So then the defense says the trailer was transferred into a storage facility. If you guys remember, they, hitched him up and took him to this storage facility. So the defense asked how long until it was transferred, and he says, I don't know. So then the defense shows an aerial photo, and there are so many vehicles on Chris Sr.'s property, y'all. I mean, I don't know if I can count them all. He got photos and applied he got photos of some of the vehicles that were in the vicinity of the trailer. The agent also did the fingerprint swabbing to see, and he couldn't get any. So then he was asked, if Chris Sr.'s house, you have the road that goes in front of his house, and then you have dirt roads that kind of go up into his yard. And the defense asked, did you document any tire prints in the dirt roads? The agent said he looked for tire tracks and footwear impressions and found none. So then there's a question asked about a red pickup truck. And do you see it? And he says, yes. And then he asks, is there another red truck in the vicinity? And he says, it's towards Frankie's house, which is right next door. And he says, yes. So on redirect, the prosecution talks about where he found the eyeglasses of Gary's. Were you able to see that lens in relation to where the blood was? And you took a swab of blood. Why? The agent said accumulation of blood in that area is likely where Gary fell and laid after being shot. It was Gary's blood. And then the prosecutor said that the defense indicated a struggle, and the agent says there was no indication of a struggle. The prosecution said it appeared the chair had been pushed. There is a chair in the middle of that room, or actually it's kind of right when you walk in that front door. The agent said, I felt it had been spun around because the bullet hole that goes down underneath the trailer, to see where that bullet hole was, it was partially covered by that chair. So they know in some way that chair was moved. Whether it's Chris Sr., trying to get away from things, I don't know. But it was a downward strike on that, it was shot down. So he took swabs from the drag mark area, and in the living room, it confirmed it was Chris's. So then, was this scene held or frozen when you left at 3 a.m.? And he said, absolutely. It didn't have to be, but he wanted to make sure it was held with deputies so nobody could go in. It was actually held and guarded until those trailers were moved to the best of his knowledge, and there was no recross. So you just kind of wonder, well, what's up? I mean, the defense is, I don't know. I just can't put my finger on it. If you guys have any theories, put it in the comments, because right now I'm really confused with the angle they're working. So the next witness today, because the last witness testified all of Friday and about half of today, is Todd Fortner. And he opted in to be recorded. He's from BCI. Initially, he responded to Frankie and Hannah Gillies, and he works with that. They call it a Faro scanner. And so they asked him to go to Chris and Gary's trailer first. So at that point, he knew there were 7 victims at 3 locations. So they started dividing staff up. He was assigned to Frankie's, but not everyone knew how to operate that scanner. So he ended up at the other scenes. He did a walkthrough and decided to scan Frankie's house, do the 3D scanning. Then he was requested to start at Chris's first. So he leaves, and they laugh about, the prosecutor and the witness laugh about how particular the prior witness, Shane Hanshaw, is about crime scenes. He's very funny. And Hanshaw pointed out a bloody shoe print just inside the door and told him to avoid it, and asked him to suit up before going in as well. So he kind of explains a Faro scanner, what it does. It's a laser scanner, and you can buy these at Home Improvement where they scan from wall to wall, and it will give you a distance. But with these special scanners, they do like 7 million points in a few minutes, and it's able to render just a super accurate, I guess, like 3D version of the interior of the house. So it's pinpoints actually that they do in a short time. And that 3D mock-up is really cool. I may try to post in the community tab on YouTube a video showing it. It's really neat how it works. So he decides to scan wherever the evidence kind of is. And usually they start from the outside and go inside. And so the agent has to go to the prosecution table at this point to operate the software to show. And then we go back to this photo that we've shown of that trajectory. This is actually what that 3D scanner did. So when he first walked in, he saw bullet strikes on the porch and around the door area. And then there is a picture of that gray and silver truck and 2 men in Tyvek suits that they show, just showing that they were suited up. So he goes in and scans just inside that front door behind the chair, and he saw the footprints and the drag marks. So, um, he puts up scans throughout the whole house, including the bedrooms, and at this point, they're showing, what has the bodies in the frame, so we can't see it. They did have the camera on the family at this time, and they were visibly upset, and I kinda wish they would put the camera on the family when they're showing bodies. We know they're gonna be upset. Just my thing. So then he gives the distance of the drag marks of Chris Sr. He processes scene 2, and there was a meeting with everyone to discuss the next steps in the investigation around midnight. Everyone kind of threw in the information that they had, and there was information he found out at that little meeting that made him want to go back, which he had intended to anyway. But the one thing he wanted to do was this trajectory reconstruction at Chris's at the front door. So he could tell this was a rifle round. They didn't find any casings. They have brass catchers too, which is supposed to catch the casing as it's ejected out. They came back a second time with actually a bomb sniffing dog because they can smell the gunpowder and they found nothing. So the trajectory of the bullet that was found under the trailer was shot straight down. And the interesting thing is it had not hit Chris Sr. because the bullet had not expanded out. And when it hits soft tissue and goes through the body, it expands out. And it had not. So it was just a fired bullet that I don't know, it just went through the floor. So they ended up and wanted to get into this safe that's in Chris Sr.'s room. Tried to get it open, couldn't do it. They had to call the fire department to get the jaws of life to get this thing open. When they opened it, a lot of stuff fell out on the floor. It was kind of full of things. I'm gonna put some pictures up here. And so he helped search that safe. It had guns and ammo. There was more than $20,000 in this safe. And there was a baggie with a white substance that appeared to be drugs and also a bag of dry rice. Now, this is just speculation on my part, but it kind of makes sense. The dry rice helps to dry out like drugs like cocaine and things like that. So I think that may be why, because the bag had a white substance. There was a wallet with a driver's license that was actually for little Chris. If you remember, he was on restrictions because he had broken curfew. And so maybe Dana gave him little Chris's driver's license and his wallet. They found social security cards for Gary, Frankie, and his son Ruger. And they had found handguns and long guns taken from the safe. They also found a GPS tracker in that safe, although they really didn't say. Now, this is the number of guns, y'all, that fit in that safe. It is, I mean, it's a ton. So the defense asks on cross, is that all the guns? And he said, I don't know. I counted, I don't know how many they were. So the defense counts 16 guns at least in that picture. So he gets into the trajectory rods. It's really confusing because we couldn't see what they were talking about because this is, just inside the bedrooms where the bodies are. So that's essentially where it ended today. I wish there were more photos to show because it really does add to being able to visually understand what's going on, but that's just not going to be the case in this trial. And what they originally said was going to be 30 days now, it's going to be 2 to 3 months. So hopefully a lot of people will opt in. There's going to be some more agents testifying this week. I think it's just going to be a lot of the same about shell casings at all the different murder scenes, trajectory, going to be these 3D renderings. At some point, the coroner is expected, but that's not going to be much because the coroner doesn't do the autopsies. Maybe the medical examiner this week. So I think every other day is where we're headed with this. Tomorrow, promise, the episode will be episode 2 on Netflix, Sins of Our Mother. I'm halfway through making my notes. And anyway, so I hope you guys have a good night. This isn't like the most interesting stuff with this case, but it's very important because it shows the brutality of these crimes and the intricate planning of knowing where the DVRs were to go unhook those and take them. Don't worry about taking the cameras down. Let's just get the DVRs, the number of bullet holes. Just you see, it's almost like I think if this had failed at Chris Senior's house because you got George and then you've got Jake firing from outside with a rifle. What if Gary had come out with a gun and got Billy? Or there's so many possibilities, and unfortunately that didn't happen, and a lot of people are dead. But yeah, so I think stuff like this, even though it can get a little bit repetitive, is still important because every crime scene tells a story, and there were so many victims that um, I do wanna cover every crime scene, but we'll do it every other day. So, all right, see you tomorrow back on Lori Vallow Daybell. We're still looking out for that ruling about cameras, and so if I hear about that, I'll hop on and let you know. Have a good night, y'all.